the man who saved the world by doing nothing. What if I told you the only reason you're alive today is because one man chose to do nothing? No explosions, no speeches, no hero music, just silence, and a single decision that prevented the end of the world. This is the story of Stanislav Petrov, the man who saved humanity with a calm stare and a refusal to follow orders. This is Utak Diaries, where the craziest true stories are the ones you've never heard of. Subscribe now, because next time, silence might save your life too. On September 26, 1983, the world came closer to nuclear annihilation than it ever had before or since. The Cuban Missile Crisis gets all the attention in history books. But that night, in 1983, one Soviet officer's decision to trust his gut over his training literally saved every person on Earth. The Cold War was at its most dangerous point in decades. Ronald Reagan had just called the Soviet Union an evil empire and announced his Strategic Defense Initiative, which the Soviets saw as preparation for a first strike. The Soviets had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 just 3 weeks earlier, killing all 269 people aboard, including a U.S. congressman. Tensions were so high that both superpowers were operating under the assumption that nuclear war was not just possible, but probable. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was not supposed to be the man standing between civilization and oblivion that night. He was filling in for a colleague at the Serpukhov 15 bunker, a secret facility south of Moscow that monitored the Soviet Union's early warning satellite system. The bunker was the nerve center of the Soviet nuclear defense network, designed to detect incoming American missiles and alert the Kremlin within minutes of launch. Petrov was 44 years old, a software engineer by training who had been reluctantly drafted into military service. Unlike many of his colleagues, he had not grown up dreaming of military glory. He was methodical, analytical, and perhaps most importantly, skeptical of the very system he was tasked with operating. He had helped design parts of the early warning system and knew its limitations better than almost anyone. At 12:15 a.m. Moscow time, the computers began screaming. The massive screens in the bunker lit up with the most terrifying message possible. Launch, launch, launch. The system detected not one, but 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles heading toward the Soviet Union from the United States. According to the computers, nuclear war had begun. The protocol was crystal clear. Petrov's job was not to think or analyze or question. His job was to immediately notify his superiors, who would then alert the Kremlin, which would launch a full-scale nuclear retaliation within minutes. The entire system was designed for speed, not contemplation. In nuclear warfare, hesitation meant death. But Petrov hesitated. As alarms blared and his subordinates looked to him for orders, he stared at the screens and felt something was wrong. The system showed 5 missiles, but Petrov knew that if the Americans were launching a first strike, they would send hundreds, maybe thousands of missiles, not just 5. A limited strike made no strategic sense. It would be suicide for the Americans to launch just 5 missiles and leave the Soviet nuclear arsenal intact for retaliation. The computers continued their urgent warnings. The missiles were supposedly getting closer every second. His training, his orders, and every protocol demanded that he'd pick up the phone and report the attack. The weight of the Soviet Union's nuclear doctrine pressed down on him. Launch on warning was the policy. Don't think, just react. But Petrov had another problem with what he was seeing. The early warning system relied on satellites that detected the heat signatures of missile launchers. Petrov knew the system had glitches. He had seen false alarms before, though never at this scale. The satellites sometimes mistook sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launchers. The system was sophisticated but not infallible. As precious minutes ticked by, Petrov made a decision that defied everything he had been trained to do. He declared the alert a false alarm. He did not pick up the phone. He did not notify his superiors. He sat in his chair, watching the screens, and waited. His subordinates were incredulous. The computers were showing an active nuclear attack, and their commanding officer was doing nothing. Some of them began to panic. The protocols existed for a reason. What if Petrov was wrong? What if American missiles were actually heading towards Soviet cities while they sat in their bunker, paralyzed by their commander's inaction? Petrov later described those minutes as the longest of his life. He was betting the survival of his country on his intuition. If he was wrong, if the attack was real, millions of Soviet citizens would die because he failed to follow orders. He would be responsible for the greatest military disaster in human history. But if he was right, if he followed protocol and reported a false alarm as real, he would trigger a nuclear war that would kill hundreds of millions of people around the world. The minutes stretched on. According to the computers, the missiles should have been hitting their targets. But there were no explosions, no reports of nuclear detonations from Soviet cities, no confirmation from ground-based radar systems, which should have detected the incoming missiles as they approached Soviet airspace. Slowly, agonizingly, it became clear that Petrov had been right. The satellite system had malfunctioned. There were no American missiles. There was no nuclear attack. The computers had been fooled by a rare alignment of sunlight and high-altitude clouds that created the perfect conditions for a false alarm. But Petrov's ordeal was far from over. When his superiors learned what had happened, they were furious. He had violated direct orders. He had ignored established protocol. He had made a unilateral decision that could have resulted in the destruction of the Soviet Union. The fact that he had been right was almost beside the point. In the rigid hierarchy of the Soviet military, following orders was more important than being correct. Petrov was subjected to intense interrogation. Military investigators wanted to know why he had ignored his training. They questioned his loyalty, his competence, and his judgment. Some suggested he should be court-martialed for insubordination. The incident was classified at the highest levels, and Petrov was warned never to speak about what had happened. The investigation dragged on for months. Petrov's career was effectively over. He was transferred to a less sensitive position and eventually forced into early retirement. The Soviet system had no place for officers who thought for themselves, even when their independent thinking saved the world. For years, Petrov lived in obscurity. The Soviet government never acknowledged what had happened that night in September 1983. There were no medals, no commendations, no recognition of any kind. The man who had prevented nuclear war was treated as a problem to be managed and forgotten. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the end of the Cold War, that Petrov's story began to emerge. Western journalists and digging through declassified documents and interviewing former Soviet officials slowly pieced together the events of that night. They realized that the world had come far closer to nuclear war than anyone had known. When Petrov's story finally became public, the reaction was extraordinary. He was invited to the United States, where he was honored by the United Nations and received awards from peace organizations around the world. The man who had been punished by his own government for preventing nuclear war was finally recognized as a hero by the international community. But Petrov himself remained modest about his role in history. In interviews, he insisted that he had simply done his job as he understood it. He had used his knowledge of the early warning system to make the best decision he could with the information available. He didn't see himself as a hero, just as a man who had been in the right place at the right time, with the right knowledge to make the right choice. Petrov died in 2017 at the age of 77, still living quietly in a small town outside Moscow. His death went largely unnoticed by the world's media. There were no state funerals, no global tributes, no moment of silence for the man who had saved humanity. The story of Stanislav Petrov is a reminder of how fragile our world really is. Nuclear war was prevented not by grand diplomacy or military strategy, but by one man's decision to trust his judgment over his orders. In a system designed to eliminate human error, human judgment saved us all. We celebrate generals, politicians, and celebrities, but the man who saved the world lived alone, quiet, and largely forgotten. His name was Stanislav Petrov, and he may have made the most important decision of the entire 20th century. Not by acting, but by choosing not to act. Not by following orders, but by having the courage to disobey them when disobedience meant survival for everyone on Earth. This was Utak Diaries, where real history is weirder, quieter, and more powerful than fiction. Subscribe, like, and share, because if one calm voice saved humanity, maybe the next one is listening.